The air in the grand ballroom was thick with a mix of expensive perfume and hushed excitement. It was the kind of night that people would talk about for months. The centennial gala for the oldest and most respected hotel in the city. From the high-ceiling, giant crystal chandeliers poured down a warm golden light, making the wine glasses sparkle and the jewelry of the guests glitter like a field of tiny stars. Every detail was perfect, from the crisp white tablecloths to the soft classical music floating from hidden speakers. And at the center of it all, watching his masterpiece unfold, was the hotel manager. He was a man who lived for perfection, and tonight he had achieved it. He moved through the crowd with a practiced smile, shaking hands, nodding at important guests, his chest swelling with a quiet, deep pride. He had poured his heart and soul into this evening, and seeing everyone so happy, so impressed, made all the stress worth it. The real crown jewel of the evening, however, was not the champagne or the food. It was the piano. Sitting alone on a raised platform in the center of the room was an antique Steinway, its black lacquer finish gleaming under the lights. It was a masterpiece of an instrument, worth more than some of the cars parked in the hotel's valet lot. But its value tonight was in who was going to play it. The manager had managed, through a lot of convincing and a very large check, to book the most famous pianist in the world. People called him a genius, a magician who could make the ivory keys sing and weep. The guests were buzzing about it, their conversations always circling back to the upcoming performance. "Did you hear? He flew in just for this," one woman in a silk dress whispered to her friend. "I heard he only drinks a specific brand of water, and they had to ship it in," a man in a tuxedo replied. The legend of the star performer had grown larger than life, and the anticipation was a palpable thing. A low hum of energy beneath, the chatter and clinking glasses, moving through the edges of this world of wealth. In glamour was a woman in a simple gray uniform. She was part of the housekeeping staff, a ghost in the machine of the grand evening. Her job was to be invisible, to clear away empty glasses and plates without anyone noticing she was there. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her eyes downcast, her focus on her work. But every so often her gaze would drift up from the tables and land on the stage, on the lonely, beautiful piano. When she looked at it, something changed in her eyes. The busy, detached look of a worker would soften, replaced by a distant, almost sad expression. For a brief moment, she wasn't a maid in a crowded room. She was somewhere else, in another time, and the piano was not just an object, but a doorway to a life she once dreamed of. Then, a guest would motion for her, and the spell would be broken. Her eyes would go down again, and she would go back to being invisible. Just another part of the perfect background the manager had so carefully created an hour before the performance was set to begin. The manager was in his element, giving final instructions to the staff in a small room behind the kitchen. He was calm, confident, the picture of a man in control. That's when a young assistant, his face pale and his eyes wide, burst into the room. He was holding a phone in his hand as if it were a live snake. The manager looked at him, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it?" "We're about to begin the final seating," he said, his voice sharp. The young man swallowed hard, stammering as he spoke. It's the pianist, sir. There's been a problem." The manager felt a small, cold knot form in his stomach. He took the phone. On the other end was the star's personal assistant, speaking in a rushed, apologetic tone. The words "sore throat," "doctor's orders," and "deeply regrettable" swam in the air, but the manager barely heard them. He heard only the one thing that mattered. The star wasn't coming. At first he refused to believe it. This had to be a joke, a last-minute diva tantrum. He started shouting into the phone, making threats, promising more money, but it was no use. The line went dead. The manager stood there for a long moment, the phone still in his hand, the sounds of the happy party seeming a million miles away. Panic, cold and sharp, began to creep up from the pit of his stomach. His perfect evening was crumbling. He started making frantic calls, to his boss, to other musicians, to anyone he could think of. But it was too late. It was an hour before showtime on the biggest night of the year. No one was available. No one could save him. He walked out of the office and back towards the ballroom, his face a mask of calm that was cracking with every step. The guests were still smiling, still laughing, but now their glances at the empty stage seemed less patient, more questioning. The low hum of anticipation had turned into a restless murmur. He looked at the beautiful piano sitting there in the spotlight, and it seemed to be mocking him, silent reminder of his failure. The evening, he realized with a sickening certainty, was a complete and total disaster. While the manager's world was crumbling in his small office, a different kind of reality was playing out in the grand ballroom. The mood of the guests had begun to shift. The excited chatter had a new edge to it, a note of impatience. People were checking their watches, looking towards the stage, and then back at the empty entrance. The low hum of the party was no longer one of pure anticipation. It was laced with confusion and a growing annoyance. And in the middle of all this, moving like a ship in a calm sea, was the woman in the gray uniform. Her name was Clara, and she had been working at this hotel for 10 years. 10 years was a long time to be invisible. She had learned the art of it, the quiet way of moving through a room without disturbing the air, of being in the middle of a conversation without ever being a part of it. Her uniform was her camouflage, her tray of empty glasses, her shield. She saw everything and was seen by no one. She knew which guests were the biggest tippers, which ones were rude to the staff, and which ones would spill a drop of red wine and then pretend it never happened. She was a silent observer, a keeper of the hotel's small, secret histories. But tonight her focus was not on the guests or their expensive jewelry or their hushed complaints. Her eyes were drawn again and again to the stage, to the beautiful silent piano. To everyone else in the room, it was just a part of the decoration. It's a very expensive and impressive prop for the evening's entertainment. But to Clara, it was so much more. It was a ghost. It was the ghost of a life she once had, a person she used to be. Every time she looked at it, she felt a strange pull, a mix of deep longing and a sharp, familiar pain. She saw herself as a young girl. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her fingers smudged with a little bit of ink from her schoolwork. She saw herself sitting at a much older, less grand piano in a small, dusty room that smelled of old wood and polish. In that room, there was no one to impress, no guests to please. There was only her and the music. She remembered the feeling of the keys, cool and smooth under her fingertips. She remembered the way her heart would race when she mastered a difficult piece, the way a simple melody could make her feel like she was flying. Music wasn't just a hobby for her. It was the air she breathed. It was the language she understood best. She had been good, too. Really good. Good enough to earn a scholarship to a fancy music school in the city, a place where she was supposed to go and turn her dream into her life. She remembered the day she got the letter, the way her hands shook as she opened it. Her parents had hugged her so tight, their faces shining with pride. For a few months, everything was perfect. She practiced for hours every day, her fingers growing stronger and faster, her soul pouring into every note. The future was a bright, shiny thing, and it was all hers for the taking. Then life happened. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden event, but a slow, creeping storm. First, her father got sick. The medical bills started to pile up, a mountain of paper that grew higher every month. Her mother tried to work more, but she was tired and worried all the time. The scholarship paid for her classes, but it didn't pay for rent or food or the medicine her father needed. Clara started to feel guilty. Every hour she spent practicing felt like an hour she wasn't helping her family. The dream that had felt so real started to feel like a selfish fantasy. When her mother's health also began to fail, the choice was made for her. She had to leave the school. She remembered the last time she saw her teacher, the sad look in the woman's eyes. "Don't let this be the end," the teacher had told her. "The music is still inside you." But Clara didn't feel like there was any music left inside her. There was only a heavy, quiet space where the joy used to be. She got the job at the hotel because it was steady work, because it paid the bills. She traded her piano for a cleaning cart, her sheet music for a list of rooms to be tidied. At first, it was painful. She would hear music playing in the lobby or at a wedding and have to leave the room to keep from crying. But time, as they say, heals all wounds, or at least it covers them with a thick scar. She learned to lock that part of herself away. She became Clara the maid, efficient and invisible. The girl who played the piano became a ghost, a memory she only visited in her quietest moments, but she never really forgot. Every night after the last guest had gone to bed and the ballroom was dark and empty, she would sometimes finish her cleaning and then just stand there, looking at the piano. On a few rare brave nights, she would walk up onto the stage. She would lift the heavy lid, the smell of the wood and felt filling the air. She would sit on the bench, her posture automatically straightening, just like her old teacher had taught her. And she would place her fingers on the keys, feeling the familiar, comforting coolness. She never pressed down. She never played a note. The fear was too big. What if she had forgotten how? What if the magic was gone for good? It was better to keep the memory perfect than to risk ruining it. So she would just sit there, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys, aching to play, but never daring to. It was a secret ritual, a quiet conversation with the ghost of her former self. Then, after a few minutes, she would close the lid, walk away, and go back to being invisible now, standing in the corner of the ballroom. She watched the manager pace back and forth near the stage, his face pale with worry. She could feel the tension in the room, the disappointment of the guests like a heavy blanket. She saw the problem, the empty stage, the silent piano, but she didn't see a solution. She just saw a beautiful instrument that was about to go to waste, another sad song and a life full of them. She adjusted the tray on her hand, lowered her eyes, and went back to her work. A ghost in the wings of a show that was falling apart. The manager felt like he was drowning. The news of the pianist's cancellation was a wave of cold water that had pulled him under. Now he was struggling to find the surface. He stood in the small, stuffy office behind the kitchen, the phone still in his hand, its dead weight a reminder of his failure. The sounds from the ballroom, which had once been a symphony of success, now seemed like a distant, mocking chorus. Every clink of a glass, every burst of laughter, was a tiny hammer blow against the crumbling walls of his perfect evening. He could feel a cold sweat prickling his forehead, and his heart was beating a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs. This was more than just a ruined show. This was his reputation, his career, his entire life's work, all poised on the edge of a cliff. He took a deep breath, trying to force the air into his lungs and the panic out of his mind. He was a professional. He had handled crises before. A burst pipe in the presidential suite, a food poisoning scare at a wedding, a lost reservation for a famous actor. He had always found a solution. But this was different. This was live. This was public. And he had less than an hour. He started making calls. His fingers, usually so steady, fumbled with the contacts on his phone. He called the city's best jazz club, but their band was in the middle of a set. He called a music academy, but it was late and all the students were gone. He even considered playing a recording over the sound system, but the thought of it was humiliating. It was an admission of defeat, a cheap trick that would fool no one. With each failed call, the knot in his stomach tightened. The guests weren't just waiting anymore. They were getting angry. He could see it through the small round window in the office door. The smiles were gone, replaced by frowns and impatient glances at their watches. A couple had already gathered their coats and were heading for the exit, a small, silent judgment that felt like a public condemnation, defeated. He put the phone away. There was nothing left to do. He would have to go out there, face the crowd, and tell them that the main event, the reason they had all paid so much to be here, was canceled. He would have to stand on that stage and apologize, and watch as his career went up in flames. He walked out of the office, his legs feeling heavy as lead, and moved towards the ballroom. The noise hit him like a physical force. It was no longer a happy buzz. It was an angry swarm of bees. He pushed through the crowd, his practiced smile now a grim, tight-lipped mask. He ignored the questioning looks. The, "Is everything all right?" murmurs. He had one destination, the stage. He needed to see it, to stand next to the source of his failure. He walked up the 3 steps and onto the platform, the spotlight hitting him like a harsh, interrogating light. The piano sat there, gleaming and silent. It looked beautiful, but to him, it was a monument to his failure. It was an empty promise. He ran a hand over its smooth, black surface, the cool wood doing nothing to calm the fire of his anxiety. He felt trapped, exposed, like an animal in a cage. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the sea of disappointed faces. And then he saw her. Standing near the side of the stage, almost in the shadows, was the maid. She was holding a tray of empty glasses, her posture straight and still. But it was her eyes that caught his attention. While everyone else was looking at him, at the stage, at their watches, she was looking only at the piano. Her gaze wasn't one of pity or judgment. It was something else, something he couldn't quite understand. It was intense, focused, full of a strange, quiet longing. It was as if she was the only person in the room who wasn't seeing a disaster, but was seeing the instrument itself. A hot, irrational anger surged through him. Who was she to stand there so calmly? Who was she to look at that piano with such reverence when it was the cause of all his problems? The stress, the panic, the humiliation of the past hour all came rushing to the surface, and he needed to let it out. He needed a target, and she was the only one there. He took a step towards her, his voice sharp and laced with condescension. "What are you looking at?" he snapped. The maid flinched, her eyes finally pulling away from the piano to meet his. She looked startled, like a child caught with her hand in a cookie jar. But she didn't say anything. She just stood there, holding her tray. The manager's frustration boiled over. He pointed a finger at the piano, then back at her. "You think this is funny? You think it's easy?" he said, his voice rising. "You think you can just stand there and stare? You think you can do better? You think you can just sit down and play?" The words were out before he could stop them. They were cruel, ridiculous, born of a man pushed to his absolute limit. It was a rhetorical question, a mean-spirited joke at her expense. A maid playing a priceless Steinway in front of the city's elite. The idea was absurd. He expected her to look down, to mumble an apology, to scurry away like she was supposed to. He wanted her to be as small and helpless as he felt, but she didn't. She looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. There was no fear in them, no anger. Just a strange, calm resolve. For a long moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade away, and there was only the two of them standing in the spotlight. He saw something shift in her expression, a decision being made behind her eyes. It was as if his cruel, absurd challenge had unlocked something deep inside her, something that had been locked away for a very long time. And then she did the one thing he never expected. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The manager froze. His anger evaporated, replaced by a stunned, bewildered silence. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The nod wasn't an act of defiance. It wasn't a challenge back. It was a simple, quiet statement of fact. It was as if she had just acknowledged a truth that he, in his panic, had completely overlooked. The challenge hung in the air between them, no longer absurd, but suddenly, terrifyingly, real. He had asked a question he never thought would be answered, and now, standing before him in a simple gray uniform, was the answer. The manager stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, the cruel words he had just spoken hanging in the air between them. He expected her to shrink, to apologize, to disappear back into the shadows from which she came. But the slight, almost imperceptible nod she gave him was not an act of submission. It was a quiet, firm acceptance. It was the calm before a storm he never saw coming. Before he could react, before he could say another word, she moved. She placed her tray of empty glasses on a small table beside her, the movement slow and deliberate. Then she began to walk towards the stage. It wasn't a walk of confidence or defiance. It was a walk of purpose. As if she were being pulled by an invisible thread that was connected directly to the polished black bench in front of the piano. The manager could only watch, his mind struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching a scene in a movie, not a real event unfolding in his own ruined gala. The room began to notice her then. At first, it was just a few people near the stage, their conversations trailing off as they saw the woman in the simple gray uniform walk past them, up the 3 steps, and onto the platform. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. People turned their heads, their brows furrowed. A few snickers rippled through the ballroom, whispers of, "What is she doing? And is this part of the show?" The contrast was stark. In a sea of shimmering silks and crisp black tuxedos, she was a monochrome figure, an anomaly that made no sense. The manager saw the condescending smiles, the shared glances of amusement, and he felt a fresh wave of panic. This was it. This was the final, humiliating nail in the coffin of his career. But the woman on the stage seemed to be in another world. She didn't hear the whispers or see the smirks. Her eyes were fixed only on the piano. She reached the bench and paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the smooth, dark wood. Then she sat down, and in that moment, everything changed. It was a subtle transformation, but it was profound. The way she held her body shifted. Her back straightened, her shoulders relaxed, her chin lifted slightly. The tired, invisible maid seemed to shed her uniform like a snake shedding its skin. In her place was a musician. She placed her fingers on the keys, not hesitantly, but with a familiar, gentle touch, as if greeting an old friend. The ballroom was still buzzing with confused murmurs, but she sat in a bubble of absolute silence, her focus complete. She took a deep, slow breath, her eyes closing for just a second. Then, she began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in a dark room. They were simple, clear, and carried a strange, haunting sadness that seemed to cut through the noise of the crowd instantly. The murmuring began to die down. One by one, heads turned. The snickers vanished, replaced by a look of intense curiosity. The melody was not a showy, attention-grabbing tune. It was delicate and complex, weaving a story of profound loss. It was the sound of rain on a window pane, of a quiet goodbye, of a dream that had been carefully folded away and stored in a dusty corner. Her fingers, which had spent 10 years scrubbing floors and polishing silver, began to move with a grace and strength that seemed impossible. They danced across the ivory keys, sometimes light as a feather, sometimes heavy with emotion. The music began to grow, to swell like a tide coming in. The sadness was still there, but now it was joined by something else. It was a feeling of struggle, of a fight against a current that was too strong. The tempo quickened, the notes becoming more complex, more urgent. You could hear the frustration, the years of hard work, the quiet sacrifices. It was the sound of a life lived in the background, a voice that had been silenced for too long. The entire ballroom was held captive. Glasses were frozen mid-air. Conversations were forgotten. A woman in the front row who had been looking bored and impatient had a single tear tracing a path down her perfectly powdered cheek. The man next to her, who had been checking his phone every few minutes, now stared at the stage, his mouth agape. The music was not just something they were hearing. It was something they were feeling. It was reaching into their own hidden corners, touching their own secret sorrows and forgotten dreams. The manager stood at the edge of the stage, his heart no longer pounding with panic, but with a strange, overwhelming awe. He was no longer seeing a maid who had wandered onto the stage. He was seeing an artist, a storyteller, a woman who was pouring her entire life's story into the keys of that piano. He saw the years of practice, the discipline, the passion that had never truly left her. He understood the look in her eyes now, the longing he had seen earlier. It wasn't just for the music. It was for the person she was when she played it. His anger, his stress, his humiliation, it all melted away, replaced by a deep, profound respect. He had accidentally stumbled upon a miracle, and he was the only one who knew how impossible it was. The music reached its peak, a torrent of sound that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. It was a cry of pain and a declaration of strength all at once. Her fingers flew across the keys, a blur of motion, producing a sound so powerful, so full of raw emotion, that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. It was the sound of a soul finally being set free. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm passed. The music softened, the tempo slowing, the melody returning to the simple, haunting notes from the beginning. It was a resolution, not a happy one, but an honest one. It was the acceptance of a hard past, but with a quiet, resilient hint of hope for the future. She played the final note. A single, clear sound that seemed to hang in the air like a star in the night sky. Then she lifted her fingers from the keys, and the ballroom was plunged into a silence so complete, so profound, that it was more powerful than any applause. It was a sacred silence, filled with the echoes of the story they had just been told. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned, transformed by the music of the woman they had never seen before. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. The final note from the piano seemed to absorb all the sound in the room, all the breath, all the thought. It was a sacred silence, heavy with the weight of the story they had just been told. People sat in their seats, frozen, their eyes fixed on the woman in the simple gray uniform who was still sitting at the piano. Her head was bowed, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She looked small and fragile on the large stage, a stark contrast to the immense power that had just flowed from her fingertips. The manager, standing at the side of the stage, felt his own heart hammering against his ribs. But it was no longer from panic. It was from a profound, overwhelming sense of wonder. Then a single person in the back stood up and began to clap. It was an older man in a worn-out suit, someone who had probably saved for months to be there. It wasn't a polite golf clap. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion, a sharp single report that broke the spell. Another person joined in, then another. It was like a starting pistol at a race. Suddenly, the entire ballroom erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical force, a wave of sound and emotion that started slow and built into a thunderous, emotional ovation that seemed to shake the very chandeliers overhead. People were on their feet, not just clapping, but cheering, whistling, their faces flushed with excitement and tears. The woman on the bench seemed to shrink under the weight of it all, her shoulders hunching slightly as if she could make herself smaller, disappear back into the anonymity she had known for so long. She slowly lifted her head and looked out at the sea of standing people, her eyes wide with disbelief. The snickers, the condescending glances, the impatient murmurs were all gone, replaced by a raw, adoring love that she had never experienced before. The manager, his face a mask of shock and awe, felt a pull, a duty. He couldn't let this moment just fade away. He walked onto the stage, his movements feeling clumsy and slow compared to the grace he had just witnessed. He approached the woman and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, looking up at him as if just remembering he was there. He leaned down and spoke to her, his voice so soft that only she could hear. "Just a moment," he said. Then he turned to the microphone, tapping it lightly. The applause began to subside, settling into a low, expectant hum. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "What you have just heard was not on the program." A small, confused ripple went through the crowd. "The artist you were scheduled to see could not be with us tonight." And in a moment of pure desperation, I challenged this young woman to play. He gestured to her, and the spotlight seemed to grow brighter around her. I had no idea. I want you all to know that this incredible, breathtaking talent is not a visiting star from some faraway land. She works here. She is one of us. She is the heart and soul of this hotel, and tonight she has given us the greatest gift we could have ever asked for. The room exploded again. The announcement made the moment even more incredible, even more miraculous. The idea that this profound music had come from one of their own, from the quiet woman who they had seen clearing tables, was almost too much to comprehend. In the front row, a well-known music critic, who had come to review the famous star with a cynical air, was furiously scribbling notes on his program, his usual detached expression replaced by one of wide-eyed discovery. He wasn't just reviewing a performance anymore. He was witnessing the birth of a legend. His program, once just a piece of paper, is now a historical document. The manager let the applause wash over them for another moment before he again spoke into the microphone. "I think we can all agree that the show must go on." He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. and our star has just arrived." He then turned to the woman who was looking at him with a mixture of terror and gratitude. He gently took her arm. "Come," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." He led her towards the side of the stage, away from the blinding lights and the overwhelming adoration. As they walked, the crowd parted for them, a path of awed silence. People reached out, not to touch her, but just to be close, to offer a silent nod of respect. The manager led her down the small steps and into the quiet corridor behind the ballroom. The heavy door swung shut, muffling the sound of the crowd, and they were suddenly alone in the soft, dim light. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a trembling, fragile wonder. She leaned against the wall, her legs feeling weak. The manager looked at her, not as an employee, but as an artist. He saw the tear tracks on her cheeks, the way her hands were still shaking slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice full of a gentle concern she had never heard from him before. She could only nod, unable to find her voice. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had just created such beauty. The same hands that were now rough and calloused from years of work. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't see them as a symbol of her lost dream, but as a testament to her journey. "You were never meant to be a ghost in this room," the manager said, his words quiet but certain. "Music like that, it's meant to be heard." She looked up at him, her eyes finally clear. The ghost of the girl she used to be was no longer a sad, haunting memory. The music had laid her to rest, and in her place was a new woman. One who had faced her deepest fears and found that the magic was still there, waiting for her. She was still wearing the simple gray uniform, but it no longer felt like a costume. It felt like the last remnant of a life that was now over. Her life, she knew in that moment, had just begun again.